All right, here we go. All right, so thank you again, everyone, for joining. We'd like to welcome you all to the second webinar in our series, collaboratively put together between AgLanta Grown and University of Georgia Fulton County Extension Office, detailing diseases within vegetable crops. Last week, we had a great presentation on identifying diseases within vegetable crops. This week, we are focused on managing those diseases that we've identified. So continuing the conversation here, and really happy to have such a knowledgeable group doing the presentations within our University of Georgia Extension office. So without further ado, we'll get going. What we generally like to do here within AgLanta is do a grounding and acknowledgement of the land, territories, practices, and cultures of the indigenous peoples, forcibly remove First Nations. Here in our territory is the Muskogee Creek people, excuse me. Also, the enslaved people of Africa, of the African diaspora, and the countless migrants and immigrants who largely are the laborers within our current agricultural food system today. We also want to acknowledge and uplift all people of the global majority, also known as Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, or BIPOC, as well as other individuals, groups, populations, and cultures that continue to show up for our anti-racist communities and practices for all of our benefit here in Atlanta and beyond. And additionally, we want to pay respect, gratitude, and support to all mankind, humankind, and living beings in the intersection and overlapping social identities and factors such as gender identity, caste, sexual orientation, race, class, religion, disability, physical appearance, and height. And this grounding and acknowledgement statement was written by our Urban Agriculture Director, J. Olubayowu. And we also have a quote here that we would be remiss to if we did not say, no one is free until we all are free. That's a quote by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And also want to do just a brief introduction of our team. So present on the call today, we have myself, I'm Justin Nicholson, once again, the AgLanta Grown Program Coordinator. Also on the call, we have Yesenia Maldonado, who is our Assistant AgLanta Grown Program Coordinator. She's doing a lot of behind the scenes work here. So if you do have any questions at all, you can drop those in the chat. Yesenia will do her best to make sure that we recognize everyone. Additionally, on our team, as mentioned, we have our Urban Ag Director, J. Olubayowu. Also, oh, this is a older slide, pardon. Also, we have Amina Robinson, who is our Community Engagement and Outreach Fellow, Whitney Barr, our Food Systems Innovation Fellow, and Michelle Wiseman, who is our Director of Waste Diversion and Outreach. Oh, and without further ado, let me stop sharing. And I will pass the screen over to our presenters for the evening at University of Georgia Fulton County Extension.
Okay, can you hear me now? All right, thank you so much, Justin and Yesenia. Thank you both for making this happen. And let me do one thing here. Okay. All right. Thank you to everybody for coming out. And to anybody who is coming back from last week. We had a great presentation last week from Fayette County Agent Kim Toll on sort of basics of plant pathology and identifying diseases. And per our IPM approach, which we will talk about here in a bit, we always want to identify our pest before we move into thinking about how to manage it. So now we're on the second webinar of our disease IPM series, and we're going to talk about managing vegetable diseases. If anybody out there does not grow vegetables but grows something else, you will still get a lot out of this presentation. A lot of these plant pathology, prevention of disease things cross a lot of different boundaries and will be useful for anybody growing anything. So my name is Gabrielle LaTora. I am one of 2 agriculture and natural resources agents here in UGA Extension in Fulton County. We have our other ag and natural resources agent, James Herrin, with us. He's going to be presenting the back half of the presentation. And we also have our ag educator, Norlethea Harris, here. And hopefully Norlethea will be keeping an eye on the chat as well. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in there and we'll get to them at the end. All right, let's get into it. UGA Extension is an equal opportunity, affirmative action, veteran, and disability institution. So we're going to talk first about what crop diseases are. What do we mean when we use the term crop disease? We're going to talk briefly about the integrated pest management approach and the principles behind that approach. Then we're going to move into cultural controls. These are ways that we can change the environment to make it less conducive for pests. And then I'm going to pass it over to James to talk about best practices for fungicide use. So what are crop diseases? When we use the term disease, that means an impairment of normal plant functions. And this is often caused by a pathogen. So when we use the term pathogen, we're talking about a living organism that infects a plant. So it's going to be a fungus, a bacterium, a virus. Nematodes are plant parasitic microscopic worms, worms in a sense. We could be talking about protozoa. There are a variety of pathogens. The pathogen is the actual living organism that infects the plant. And then the plant's response, which is usually negative, that impairment of normal plant functioning, that expression by the plant is the disease. So when we say disease, we're talking about the symptoms on the plant. And these are usually negative, and we have a lot of economic impacts caused by plant diseases. So we can often get reduced yields, reduced quality of whatever the harvestable portion of the plant is. When plants get infected by a pathogen, when they're in the field, that can often affect the product after it's already in storage, after harvest. So botrytis in strawberries is a good example. Botrytis is a fungus that will infect the strawberries in the field. And then once they're harvested and they're in storage, they develop a gray mold, which is botrytis. But that infection actually occurred in the field. So we can have post-harvest effects. Here in Georgia, we have an extremely hot and humid climate, which is great for disease. So disease pressure can make it so that you can't even grow certain crops, especially here in Georgia. And there are a lot of costs related to management of diseases. So there's costs in terms of labor and time. There's costs in terms of changing up your cropping system or your techniques. And if you're using products like fungicides, of course, there's a cost to buying those products. With everything we're going to talk about today, whether the control methods are chemical or non-chemical, the approach is always going to be preventative. So with plant diseases, once you have the disease, you're already experiencing the negative effects on the plant's physiology. So whatever we can do to prevent disease, we want to go that route. And so we're going to be talking about disease prevention through an integrated pest management lens. So also known as IPM, you may be familiar with this approach. This is kind of a framework for thinking about managing pests and making decisions around managing pests in your system. So it's a multi-pronged approach. It means that we're going to use lots of different methods for managing our pest, which could be an insect, it could be a weed, it could be diseases. But we're going to use lots of different management techniques in concert to get better pressure of that pest and more resilient suppression of that pest as well. We call this the many little hammers approach, and all of our techniques that we use are all the little hammers versus one big hammer, which we often think of as pesticides. So when we're using lots of little hammers, all of our different control techniques, we have a more resilient pest management approach. If one of those little hammers doesn't work, or doesn't work that season for whatever reason, we have other management tactics that are in place that can help us with our pest suppression. So our little hammers are the tools in our toolbox, so to speak. We've got biological controls. This means using other living organisms to suppress our pathogens. We can use resistant crop varieties that already exhibit biological traits that show resistance to disease. We have mechanical and physical controls. These are physical things that we can do to prevent or reduce disease. We have cultural controls. These are things that we do to modify the environment to make it less conducive for pests. And we do have pesticides. It's your choice if you want to use pesticides in your IPM plan, but they are a tool in the toolbox. We're going to talk later about the fact that you can use pesticides judiciously and effectively and safely. These are the things that we will talk about today. I'm not really going to address biological controls because it's a huge topic. And biological controls tend to be used a little more in insect pest management. I think James might touch on biofungicides, not sure. But in general, we're going to talk about everything else. So, as I mentioned, cultural controls are practices that reduce pest establishment, reproduction, dispersal, and survival. And the goal of cultural control is to make the crop environment less suitable for pests. So if anybody was here last week to see Kim's talk, she talked about the disease triangle, but it's such an important concept in disease management that I want to bring it up again. So the disease triangle tells us that we need 3 different components for disease to occur. We need a pathogen that can infect our crops. We need a susceptible host, that is a plant that can be infected by the pathogen. And we need an environment where this pathogen is able to survive, reproduce, and infect our plant. And when we have these 3 things, we get disease, or we could get disease. That means that from our management approach, we can choose to target any one of these 3 components in order to disrupt the disease cycle. And we'll talk about the different ways that we can disrupt the pathogen, we can disrupt the host, or we can disrupt the environment. So David Burley, who was previously the director of the U Garden, if anybody is familiar with the U Garden on the UGA Athens campus, he said you can't change the climate, meaning our hot and humid climate here in Georgia, but you can change what you grow, when you grow it, and how you grow it. And that to me sounded like cultural control in a nutshell. So the first sort of avenue where we can look at cultural controls is manipulating the environment. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is plant spacing and trellising. The idea behind correct spacing and trellising is that we're going to improve airflow through the canopy of the plants around the fruits. When we have adequate spacing, we're not cramming our plants up next to each other so we can get good airflow and reduce humidity. Another benefit of trellising, something like tomatoes, is that we're keeping the fruit off of the ground. So there are quite a few soil-borne pathogens, meaning they exist in the soil, and they're much less likely to infect your plants if your plants are not contacting the soil. So trellising is great for anything that's vining or spreading. You can even do it on cucurbits. If you trellis something like watermelons, other melons, or large squash, you can create a sling to go around your fruits and hang that from the trellis. And so just the fact of not having plant material and fruits touching the soil will really reduce disease as well as the airflow benefits. Another big thing that we can do in the cropping environment is to manage our water and moisture effectively. The majority of our plant pathogens are going to be fungi, which most of them like a humid environment. So as much as we can manage water getting on the foliage or on the fruits, that's really going to reduce fungal disease primarily, and bacterial disease to some extent. For foliar diseases, drip tape is a really good option to do drip irrigation rather than overhead watering or using a sprinkler. This isn't an option for everybody. If you're a community gardener, you might be saying, well, I don't have the option of using drip tape. So if you must water overhead, we recommend watering in the morning when where there will be plenty of time for sunlight to evaporate any water that's on the leaf surface. When we water at night, that water is going to be sitting around on the leaf surface for longer, and that gives more of an opportunity for fungi to grow and germinate. We want to work on drainage in the system. You can see in this picture, we've got standing water in this field of lettuce, and that's just a breeding ground for plant pathogens. So if this person were to get a rain event later this afternoon, the new raindrops are going to be splashing water from these puddles onto lettuce, and then we're going to get transfer of pathogens that way. Not to mention, our roots don't like to be underwater. So we want to be incorporating organic matter, building our soil so that we have good drainage. If you have the option of growing under a high tunnel, that can really reduce foliar diseases as well. For something like tomatoes, that get a lot of disease pressure here in Georgia, if we can keep the foliage as dry as possible, that's really going to reduce your chances of foliar disease. I'm going to go back to this photo for our talk on sanitation. When I say sanitation, that means removing any infected plant material from the system. So if you look in this photo, you'll notice there are no dead leaves or rotten tomatoes or any other sort of crop residue in the walkway. That is good. We don't want infected plant tissue or rotting or old plant tissue to be sitting around. If you have a no-till system or you're doing chop and drop, you will have to weigh the benefits versus the risks of having decomposing plant material in the field near your crops. Sanitation also refers to taking clean pruners and removing any symptomatic plant material and getting it out of the system. You don't always need to pull up the plant. If you have a question about whether I need to remove the whole plant or just remove this affected plant tissue, just give us a call. We can talk through it. There are some diseases where you do need to remove the whole plant. There are some where you just need to remove that inoculum. So removing that plant tissue that has the pathogen on it will prevent it from spreading throughout the field. If you have a lot of pressure from soil-borne pathogens and soil diseases, you might consider soil solarization. The idea here is we're basically sterilizing the soil. So you'll lay out clear plastic or silage tarps, preferably during a hot period of the year. You'll leave it out for 6 to 8 weeks at a minimum. And sunlight will travel through the plastic, but then it can't get out. So it heats up like crazy under the plastic, and we're essentially sterilizing the soil. Yes, this will kill beneficial soil microbes as well as our pathogens. There were some studies that came out like in the early aughts and sort of late 2010s that suggested that the beneficial microbe community would bounce back more quickly than some of the soil diseases. So, you might choose to do soil solarization to gain the benefits of not having soil-borne diseases, and then choose to inoculate the soil with something like compost. So it is an option. It's kind of the nuclear option, but it can be a good sort of regular maintenance activity. All right, that was manipulating the environment. We're going to talk about manipulating the host, meaning your plants. The number one thing that you can do to prevent disease in your crops is to plant resistant varieties. This is the most reliable way to prevent disease. And there are resistant varieties everywhere. Resistant varieties means that plant breeders have bred certain resistance traits into different varieties. So I did a quick search on Johnny's seeds and went to tomatoes, because of course tomatoes have like the most diseases. And over on their drop-down menus, their filters, there's a whole disease resistance category. So these are all the diseases that they have seeds expressing resistance traits for. So if you have a serious issue with late blight, or maybe you have a problem with powdery mildew on your tomatoes, you might opt to look at powdery mildew resistant seed varieties. We can also rotate our crops. This is generally a best practice for soil fertility, for plant diversity, but it's a really good management tactic for disease prevention as well. And what this means is not planting the same crop in the same bed year after year after year, season after season. We want to plant plants from different plant families in successive seasons. When we plant the same crop or the crops from the same plant family in the same location year after year, pathogens that can infect that plants in that family are going to build up in that spot. So when we rotate our crops in space, we break up the disease life cycle. Okay, so crop rotation is going to be really important. We can also modify our planting dates somewhat. We only have so much wiggle room in terms of planting dates. But for instance, in Georgia, we can typically get 2 seasons of squash. So we can generally do a spring crop and a fall crop of like summer squash. The fall crop tends to have much more disease and pest pressure, insect pressure. So we could opt just to push hard for the spring crop of squash. Or maybe we could push tomatoes early or late, depending on when we're seeing disease pressure. So moving our planting dates to avoid sort of the most susceptible time periods is an option potentially. We also want to make sure that we're using clean seed and transplants. So make sure that you're buying from a reputable seed dealer that you trust. And if you're growing from transplants, really inspect those transplants before you bring them into your system. The idea here is that we don't want to introduce inoculum or pathogens that weren't already in our system. Yes, they might happen to show up at some point, but when we bring in diseased plant material, we're just introducing it where it wasn't previously there, potentially. So really inspect your plants. I don't know how much you can really inspect your seeds, so just do a little research and make sure that you trust your seed dealer. The last thing is we want to make sure that we are treating our plants right and that they're as healthy as possible. So just like us, when we are eating well, we're getting enough sleep, we don't have too much stress, we're not as likely to get sick. The same is true of plants. We want to be giving them everything they need to be as healthy as possible, and they're going to be more inherently resistant. So I like to say a healthy plant is a strong plant, and a strong plant is a resistant plant. It's not necessarily immune from disease, but it's less likely to experience negative effects following infection by a pathogen. So we always want to make sure that we're following the right plant, right place principle. That means putting a plant in a place where the conditions are right for that type of plant. We want to make sure that our soil fertility and our pH are adequate for whatever plant we're growing. We might have all the soil nutrients available for a specific plant, but if the pH is outside of the range that that plant likes, then those nutrients are not available to that plant. So a good example is blueberries. We know that blueberries like acidic soil, very acidic, much more acidic than our vegetable crops. And so if we're growing blueberries in a pH, normal pH of like 6 or 7, it cannot access the soil nutrients that are there in the soil. And so it's not going to grow as well. We want to make sure that we're providing enough sunlight for our plants, depending on what plant it is, and irrigation and drainage. We want to make sure are adequate for that type of plant. Some plants can tolerate wet feet better than others. So we need to know that that's part of our right plant, right place principle. All right, that's about all I have. I'm going to stop sharing and I'll pass it over to James.
Yeah, and I'll pick it up. Thank you, Gabrielle. All right. So after you have addressed the two parts of the disease triangle, the environment and the plant itself, and how you're treating that plant or how you're manipulating the environment to promote that plant's health, you can
Hey, James, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're in, I don't know what it's called. You want to switch your view to presentation mode.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yep, you're
Yes,
good.
perfect.
Cool. Good. Thank you. So once you've managed the environment and the plant itself, you can begin to look at chemical control options. And we do have quite a few available that target the pathogens that lead to plant disease that can affect the plant. It can sometimes kill it. It can affect harvest. So you can have a lot of downstream effects, the diseases, if they're not controlled. So we do have chemical options, including fungicides and nematicides. So we think generally about pesticides, and then those that target insects, we call insecticides. This is similar. We have those that target fungal pathogens. So those are the fungicides. And then Gabrielle mentioned nematodes. We also have products that chemistries that are available that will address nematodes. Some of the chemicals are applied to the plant itself, and others are applied to the environment. So an example with the soil-borne nematodes, sometimes you will treat the soil prior to planting to reduce the number of nematodes in the area. So it's not always being applied to the plant. And sometimes the plant is not even in the ground yet. We have both contact and systemic chemistries available to control plant diseases. A contact pesticide is going to, its action, the chemistry will take effect when the active ingredient comes into contact with the pest or with the pathogen itself. So you need to make sure that you're going to get contact, that you're getting good coverage. A contact pesticide needs to cover the plant in the susceptible areas, because if that if the product doesn't come into contact with the pathogen in the place where it's going to infect the plant, then it will have no effect. So you want to pay attention to that, and there's a lot of resources available to figure out if you're going to use a chemical, what type it is, and we're available here at Extension to help you do that too. A systemic product is translocated within the plant before the active ingredient is effective against the pest. So in this case, we want the plant to absorb through the leaves or maybe through the roots the chemical, and then once it's inside the plant, that's when that active ingredient will be effective. Typically, a systemic can be slower because you want that translocation to occur. So you want to pay attention to that. In addition, we have conventional chemistries and organic. So there are chemistries available even if you're trying to follow organic practices. when you look at the OMRI list of fungicides and nematicides, before you use a chemical, it's required actually that you follow the other components of an IPM, of an integrated pest management approach. So right plant in the right place, and the cultural methods that are available to you. You need to do everything you can to select resistant varieties and grow plants that are strong and resistant. Like Gabrielle said, they won't be necessarily immune, but there are options available to you when even if you're trying to follow organic requirements. A biofungicide. So these are chemicals and compounds created by either microbes, so it might be another fungus, it might be a bacteria, but another microorganism that produces a compound or competes with the pathogen. So in some cases, a microbial fungicide, biofungicide, could be what Gabrielle was mentioning with biocontrol. We might actually be introducing a competitive microbe that will not affect your crop, but will inhibit the negative effects of the pest. There are also, though, plant compounds. So there are plant-based biofungicides and microbial compounds. So these would be chemicals created by plants in nature or microbes, and then these are extracted or synthetically manufactured to then be used as a fungicide. So that's what we mean whenever we talk about biofungicides. Anytime you're using any type of these pesticides, fungicides, nematicides, whether, it doesn't matter if they're contact or systemic, doesn't matter if it's conventional or organic, or even these biofungicide products, they all include labels. And so we think that it's a good idea, and we would encourage you to get training in pesticide use and consider getting an applicator's license. This would give you drastically increase your knowledge of what products are available, how do you safely apply those products in your situation, and how do you judiciously use these products. So we really want to guard against, and so education training can really help us guard against overuse of these chemicals. If you do go through pesticide training, you are potentially eligible to apply for an applicator's license, which would just grant you access to more chemistries. So there are some chemicals, some of these pesticides you're not going to be able to purchase them. They're called restricted use, and they are restricted to use only by licensed applicators. So this is something that you can, the trainings are done through Extension and other organizations, but the licensing is handled by the Georgia Department of Agriculture. So we talked about what options are available, and there are a lot of options. I guess I should have said too, we're not going to go into as many specifics of any particular plant, vegetable, or disease, and how do you control that one. And I'm trying to go over some of the general considerations. And so if you have moved to use one of the chemical control options available, there's some considerations that you need to make. I mentioned that the label. So every product that you're going to use, every registered pesticide, they're registered by the US EPA. And so if they are registered, then it includes a label, and that label is the law. The label is going to include what pests are approved to treat with that chemical. It's going to also indicate what crops it's approved to use it on. So just because you know something, a chemical pesticide is effective against a pest, if you're using it on an unapproved crop, that can lead to regulatory and legal issues. So you do want to look at that. There's also safety details, safety for the applicator and for other people in the area. So it might include how long after you use that chemical can you re-enter the cropping area? How long do you need to wait until you harvest after using a chemical? So all of these things. So we're looking out for the safety of the applicator, for folks working on the farm, and for the eventual consumers of the crop after harvest. The label will include approved methods of application. So how are you going to apply the compounds, the pesticide to your crop? It can sometimes restrict areas or certain scenarios. So an example of this is there can be chemicals chemistries that are effective against certain pests, but should not be used too close to sensitive habitat, including waterways. And so even when you're consulting extension publications that suggest or recommend chemicals and rates, you should review the label before you use it. So the different extension services, including UGA, puts out a lot of information that's research-based that says, hey, these are effective products against certain diseases, but you still, before applying it, you want to read that label. The applicator, so whoever is the person applying the product, is liable for actions taken off label. So that's when I was mentioning, if you're trying to treat a pest that is not listed, or you're trying to treat a pest on a crop that's not on the label, you want to watch out for that. Another thing that's included on the label is going to be the rates. And these are generated for both safety and efficacy. So using less of a product is not always a sound, environmentally minded action. There's an example of glyphosate-resistant pigweed, Palmer amaranth. And so some row crops is not vegetables, but it's a story that I think the principles should apply and should be considered when you're going to use chemicals to control diseases, insects, or weeds, so any pest. But there are crops available, seeds available, that render the crop resistant to Roundup, to glyphosate. However, there was a farmer that reduced the rate of glyphosate below. He was using a below rate, but below the label, and seemed to be getting effective control of this weed. However, it generates a lot of seeds, millions of seeds, and it developed a resistance to glyphosate and now has spread from Southwest Georgia to adjacent states. So it's just important to, again, reiterate, follow the label, even if you think you can get an effective control for a few seasons with a lower rate, and you think, oh, I'm using less chemical, that's better. You might be breeding a resistant pathogen or pest that could quickly leave your farm and cause a lot of issues. Also, using more is not better. So trying to apply and really knock it hard, that can lead to plant damage. It can lead to unsafe conditions for the applicator or the consumer after harvest. Rotation of active ingredients. So we talked about rotation of active ingredients. We talked about crop rotation, Gabrielle mentioned that. Also, you want to consider rotating the chemicals that you're using. And so what you're really interested in, the label will tell you what the active ingredient is, but what you also want to look at is the mode of action. And so there's lots of places to find that. The two images that I have on this slide are from the Southeastern U.S. Vegetable Crop Handbook. This is published every year, and it's got lots of plants and diseases. It's also got weed and insect information. How do you control it? But it's referencing the FRAC code. That's the mode of action. So there's a code, and so you want to use different modes of action. Even if you're using different active ingredients, you might be using the same mode of action, and that can lead to resistance buildup in the pest. Another consideration that you should make is timing. When do you apply this? It's not always when you see the disease. Timing is very important. So this is an example of a spray schedule for blackberries. It's from an Arkansas Extension publication, but I just liked the way this one was laid out. We have them for UGA too, and I'll show one in the next slide. But I just liked how this one was laid out, because along the bottom here, we've got this timeline. So this is blackberry, so they're a perennial. So you're looking at the dormant stage up to 6-inch long shoots, and then at bloom. So in this case, the disease shows up when the fruit is on. That's when you would see that you have the disease. But the infection occurs at the bloom. So you need to get the chemical on the bushes, onto the canes of blackberries before the flowers, before the blooms break. Otherwise, you're not going to get effective control at that point. So you can see too, we've also looked at, okay, well, when should I be applying it? That's what's up here at the top. But what am I treating against, or what am I trying to control? And so that's going to change throughout the season too. We've got anthracnose the whole season, but cane leaf rust only prior to growth and then after harvest. And then we've got fruit rots anytime after bloom. So that's where symptom onset does not imply infection onset. So you may have needed to use a chemical long before you actually see the disease. This is an example of one of the generalized spray schedules provided by the University of Georgia Extension, and it's available for many crops. Some of the takeaways from this are that it's going to let you know, okay, well, what crop are we going for? It's also going to let you know what the spray schedule is. So this, hit the button, shouldn't have. Just trying to highlight it. This is going to let you know how often. So they're spraying every 7 days. That can change for some crops and diseases. You're looking at a 5-day interval. For others, you're looking at 10 to 14 days. So it's really going to vary depending on what crop you're growing. But at each spray interval, we've got some actions that you might want to take prior to planting. So there can be fungicides applied to the seeds before you put them in the ground. It could also be compounds. You might do a root dip. I was reading some about asparagus, and they actually dip the ferns before they plant them. So sometimes you're treating the transplant, sometimes you're treating the seed, sometimes in the nematicide example, you're treating the soil. But this is prior to putting anything in the ground, prior to planting. But we got a lot of information here about, okay, well, what compounds could you be using? What fungicides could you be using, and what is it treating against? And so this is the reason that this is called a generalized spray schedule. Is it's not saying you should spray everything according to this, regardless of what you've got out there. It depends on what pest you're trying to control, what disease you've seen in the past. So the spray frequency and the interval would be included in a schedule. It's going to have multiple products, but you're going to choose that product based on your crop and based on the disease that you expect, either from neighbors or the history of that site. All right, and then this is my final slide, and it is just talking about nematode control options. And for home gardeners, there are no products available. However, for commercial agriculture, for producers who are growing to sell their crops, there are some chemicals available. And these two tables here, along the bottom, we have the treatments. So on the far right of each graph is the untreated control. So this is the control. Nothing was done to that thing. And that's the same on the far right of this blue and orange graph. The graph on the left is showing the nematode numbers. So you can see that when you treat with a nematicide, these red columns are a lot lower. At the end of the season, there are a lot fewer nematodes per cubic centimeter of soil. However, and we've got one here that is a resistant variety. So actually our resistant variety did well. It was significantly different from the unchecked in terms of how many nematodes were out there. However, when you look at the yield, so this graph on the left here, our resistant variety did not perform as well as the chemically treated. So that's where you may want to consider the losses from a disease when you're considering whether or not to incur the costs of a chemical, of a nematicide or a fungicide. It's possible that you might end up with better yield, which might offset the management costs that you're going to incur. And so with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. I'd like to make y'all available or aware of our in-person workshop this Sunday. The link is here. We'll also put that in the chat if you want to. Before you leave, you can click that link and register for our workshop, where we'll go over what we talked about last week up in Alpharetta at Old Rucker Farm. And then please reach out to myself or Gabrielle if you have any questions about what we've talked about.
Okay. All right. Not seeing any hands or hearing any additional questions. Oh, somebody speaking? Okay, that may be an echo. Okay, well, if there are no additional questions or thoughts, definitely want to give a big round of applause again. Thank you so much, Gabrielle and James, for the amazing information. I learned so much. As usual, these recordings of these presentations will be available after we get all the recordings. We'll send it out via email to everyone, and it'll also be posted on our AgLanta YouTube page as well. And again, as James mentioned, we will have an in-person plant disease workshop, and the link is here. Also, let's put the link in the chat as well for everyone. And we'd love to have you join in person with us this coming Sunday. Let me drop this here for everyone. Oh, there it is. Thank you, James. Yes, Gabrielle and James' information is here as well. So we encourage everyone to reach out with any additional questions that you may have. We thank everyone for your time, and we still have about 7 minutes left. So I'll give a last call for any last minute questions, anything that's percolating.
And feel free, you can unmute yourself and ask verbally, or if you want to type it into the chat, we can accept questions both those ways.
Okay, Well, hearing none, again, greatly appreciate everyone's presence today. And with that said, we'll see you all on Sunday.
Thank you.